What do you do when your own son kicks you out of the house you paid for, shouting that you're a failure while your neighbors pretend not to stare? How does a man everyone calls old, done, replaceable walk away with one suitcase and, 48 hours later, calmly sell the company his son thinks he already owns for $8 million? Can a father who spent years being treated like a burden turn the same contracts his son ignored into the cleanest revenge he'll ever see? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Leonard Marsh, but most people just call me Leo, and if you ask my neighbors what kind of man I am, they would probably say I am quiet, always in work boots, and always the one who offers to help when someone's fuse blows or their garage door sticks. I am 63 years old, a widower, and for more than 35 years, I have been the man behind Marsh Electrical, the company whose white trucks you see all over our city with the blue lightning bolt on the side. I started it with a secondhand van, a toolbox, and a baby boy in a car seat, and I kept it going through recessions, long winters, and one very long battle with my wife's illness. People who work with me in the yard know me as the guy who shows up before sunrise and turns the lights on. People on my street know me as the man who still shovels his own driveway every winter, even when the snow gets heavy. But inside my own house, or what I thought of as my house, I had become something else. To my son, Dylan, I was just the old man who would not get out of the way. When Dylan and his wife, Kara, moved back in with me, for a while, after their second baby, it made sense at first. The house was too big for one person anyway. I told them they could stay until they got on their feet. I had already paid off the mortgage years earlier, so putting their names on the mailbox felt like a kindness, not a risk. Then, when the company bought the place from me for tax reasons that my attorney and the accountant explained in slow words, the paperwork changed, but my daily routine did not. I still woke up in the same bedroom. I still drank coffee at the same kitchen table. I still kept a spare set of keys on the same hook by the door. It was only in small moments, over time, that I began to notice how Dylan and Kara talked about the house as if I were the guest and they were the hosts. On the day everything finally cracked, the sky was clear and hot, the kind of late summer afternoon where the air hums with lawnmower engines and kids' voices. I had just come back from the yard, dust on my sleeves, after checking on a rewiring job. The company had landed a big contract with a new supermarket chain, and I spent most of the day with my foreman, Miguel, walking through plans, making sure we had enough hands on the schedule. I felt tired, but satisfied. Work still made sense. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Dylan's new truck, the one with the oversized tires and the lift kit, parked sideways like it was on display. It had the company logo and his name underneath in sleek script, Dylan Marsh, Operations Manager. I had signed off on that design myself, proud to see my son's name next to mine. There were also several cars lined up along the curb, neighbors visiting or coming home. Sprinklers ticked in the next yard. Ruth, my neighbor 2 houses down, was on her front porch, trimming some potted plants. She waved when she saw me. I raised a hand back, then noticed that our front door was open and voices spilled out into the warm air. Inside, the house smelled like lemon cleaner and frying onions. Kara had music playing low on the speaker. Dylan was at the kitchen island, leaning over some papers spread out like a fan. Kara stood beside him, arms crossed, and there were 2 of our neighbors, Kevin from across the street and his wife, hovering near the doorway with polite smiles that looked a little too tight. It was not a crowd, but it was enough people to make the room feel full. Dylan looked up when I stepped inside, and I could see at once that his jaw was tight. His eyes were bright with something that was not joy. "There you are," he said, but his tone was not welcoming. It sounded like an accusation. I took off my boots at the mat, as I always did, and asked what was going on. He tapped the stack of papers and said they had been waiting for me. They wanted to go over transition plans. The words made my shoulders tense. We had talked around this topic many times. Dylan had been pushing to formalize the handover of the company, as he liked to say, so he could finally get financing and scale. I always told him we would talk about it in time, that there were pieces he did not see yet, that we had to move carefully for the sake of the crew and our long-term clients. Today, he was not in the mood to move carefully. Kara stepped closer to him, like a second shadow. She said it was simple. I was old, I was tired, and it was time to stop blocking growth. She said they had an opportunity to refinance the house and use equity to invest in new trucks and online marketing, but the bank wanted my signature on certain forms. She said the only reason they could not move forward was because I kept dragging my feet. The neighbors by the doorway shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but they did not leave. I asked as calmly as I could to see the documents. Dylan shoved them across the island toward me, the pages sliding on the granite. I could see my name on several lines, the company's name, and terms that sounded simple but were not. I recognized enough phrases to understand that if I signed them as they were, I would be turning over control of both the house and some major parts of the company's credit lines to Dylan's hands, all at once. I asked who had drafted them. He said a friend who does real estate had helped. I told him I would not sign anything that big without my own attorney looking at it. That was when the heat in his eyes turned into something sharp. Kara sighed loudly. She told me I was being dramatic, that no one was trying to cheat me, that this was just paperwork to match reality, since everyone already saw Dylan as the true owner. She said the only one who did not seem to see it was me. Dylan's voice rose. He said that for years I had made him feel like a kid, even while he ran operations, lined up projects, and dealt with the modern world. He said I still insisted on using my old flip phone, still made notes on paper, still drove the same worn-out truck. He asked how that looked to clients when he was trying to present a serious brand. I stood there, dust on my sleeves, listening to my own son talk about me like I was a problem to solve. I told him, quietly, that I might be old-fashioned, but the contracts we had with our biggest clients were still signed with my name as managing director. I said those companies did not care if I used a flip phone. They cared that the job was done on time and done right. He scoffed and said times had changed. He did not want to spend his 40s cleaning up after an outdated man who would not let go. He said the company would not grow as long as I clung to it like a life raft. He said, in front of our neighbors and his wife, that I had built a nice little shop, but that I did not know how to take it to the next level. Every word was like sandpaper on an old wound I had pretended was healed. The room felt smaller. Tara, my granddaughter, peeked around the corner from the living room, a toy in her hand, eyes wide. I saw Ruth's shape through the open front door, still on her porch, head slightly turned toward our house. Dylan grabbed the papers again and slapped them onto a clipboard. He said he was done with discussions. Either I signed now, like a reasonable man, or I admitted I was a control freak who would rather sink the whole ship than let his son steer. I told him I would not sign anything today. I told him I was willing to sit down with my attorney, with him, with whoever drafted these, and work through things properly. He said that was just another stall tactic. Kara's voice cut in. She said it was not healthy for 3 generations to share one house, that stress was not good for the kids, that my negative energy was affecting everyone. She said I made Dylan feel small in his own home, always questioning, always hovering. It was strange to hear the house I had paid for, the roof I had kept over their heads, called his own home in that way. Dylan's jaw clenched. He snatched up my house keys from the hook by the door and held them up. He said if I would not sign, then I needed to accept that I was a guest here, and that a guest who did not respect the host's rules could leave. He raised his voice so much his words spilled out into the front yard. He said I was a failure, that I had never aimed high enough, that the only reason we were still small time was because I did not have the guts to take risks. He said all I had ever really done was get by, and now I was jealous that he might actually make something big. The neighbors outside stopped pretending not to listen. Kevin shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His wife looked at the ground. I felt all their eyes without looking back. My chest felt tight, not from anger, but from a deep tiredness, the kind that comes when you finally see clearly something you have been trying not to look at for a long time. Dylan grabbed a suitcase that I now saw had been sitting by the hallway wall, already packed with some of my clothes, my shaving kit, even a framed photo of my late wife and me from the living room shelf. Kara must have done that. They had planned this. He shoved the suitcase toward me. It hit my leg softly and tipped. He told me if I could not support his plans, I could take my things and go. I could go be a martyr somewhere else. Tara started to cry. Kara sent her upstairs with a sharp whisper. Ruth took a small step off her porch, then stopped, unsure if it was her place to intervene. My first instinct was to shout back, to remind Dylan of sleepless nights, of bills I paid, of the time I sold my only new truck to keep his college tuition on track. But the words stayed behind my teeth. I saw that nothing I said in that moment, in that kitchen, with those eyes watching, would change his mind. In his head, this was already his house, his company, his life. I was just the old shadow he needed to push out of the frame, so I did the only thing left that still felt like mine. I picked up the suitcase. I did not slam the door. I did not throw anything. I walked past my neighbors on the sidewalk, nodding when one of them mumbled an awkward greeting. Ruth's eyes were wet when she said my name softly, but she did not move closer. I rolled the suitcase down the driveway toward my old truck, the one I still registered under my name, not the company's. As I opened the door and set the suitcase inside, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it, thinking it was just another bill or a crew member asking a simple question. When I pulled it out, I saw an email notification on the small screen, the subject line half cut off. Offer to acquire Marsh Electrical. Final window to? The words blurred for a second as my eyes stung, but they were enough to make me sit there behind the wheel, hands on the steering wheel, and realize that somewhere outside this driveway, not everyone saw me as a failure after all. I sat in the truck for a long moment, the email subject line glowing on the tiny screen like it belonged to someone else's life. Offer to acquire Marsh Electrical. Final window to... I remembered that message from months back. At the time, I had read it quickly in my office, nodded to myself, and filed it away in a folder in my mind labeled Maybe One Day. I had told myself I was not ready to let go yet, that Dylan needed more time to grow into the job, that selling now would be like admitting I was finished. Now, with one suitcase on the passenger seat and my son's words still echoing in my ears, the same line looked different. It did not look like an exit. It looked like a door I had almost forgotten I had the key to. I drove to a cheap roadside motel on the edge of town, the kind with faded signs and a vending machine that ate quarters. The lady at the front desk recognized me vaguely from some past repair job and asked if I was in town for work. I told her I just needed a room for a couple of nights, paid in cash, and took the key. The room was small and smelled like cleaning spray and old air. There was a bed, a small table, a TV bolted to the wall. I put my suitcase in the corner and sat down on the edge of the bed. The silence pressed against my ears in a way the noise at home had not. I opened the email again, this time reading more carefully. It was from a man named Samir, the regional director of a facilities group that had been sniffing around the local market. Months earlier, he had sent a detailed proposal praising our safety record and our list of long-term clients. He had written that his company saw value in what we had built and wanted to talk about bringing Marsh Electrical under their umbrella. At the time, I had thanked him and said the timing was not right. This follow-up email, the one I was now reading in a motel room, said their interest remained, but their timeline was closing. If I wanted to seriously talk, we had a narrow window left. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the wall. The bed frame creaked softly. My mind drifted backward, not to the offer, but to how we had arrived at a point where the idea of selling suddenly felt less like betrayal and more like protection. I thought about the first time I took Dylan to a job site. He was maybe 5 years old, too little to lift much, but old enough to be curious. I set him on an overturned bucket and told him to stay put while I swapped out a breaker panel in a small office building. He watched every move I made. Later, he told his mother that I was fixing the nervous system of the building, and she laughed. Even after she got sick, she always told me that Dylan had my eyes and my stubborn streak, and that if I could steer that stubbornness right, he would do great things. When she died, he was in high school. Grief made both of us quiet. For a while, we sat in the same house like strangers, trying not to bump into each other. I forced myself to get up early, to keep the trucks moving, to keep the invoices going out, because the company was the one thing that did not crumble that year. I brought Dylan into it as soon as he finished school, partly to keep him close and partly because I wanted him to see what steady work looked like. At first, he seemed grateful. He showed up on time, took instruction from Miguel on the yard, asked questions about bids and timelines. He rode with me to job sites, listening as I talked him through how you land a contract and how you keep it. I told him clients remembered not just who turned the lights back on, but who answered the phone at 2 a.m. without complaining. For a while, I thought he understood. Then, slowly, things shifted. Social media became a big deal, and Dylan took it upon himself to update our image. I did not mind at first. He took photos of the trucks, made a simple website, filmed short videos of our team wiring up a new warehouse. Clients liked seeing behind the scenes. I was proud. It felt like a natural evolution. But the more attention he got online, the more his language changed. In his captions, he started to say my crew instead of our crew. He called Marsh Electrical my company when he talked to his friends, even in front of me. I corrected him a few times, gently. He would laugh it off and say it was just easier that way, that people did not want to hear about family ownership details. At barbecues, when neighbors came over, Kara would call him the boss, and me, the legend in the back office. Her tone sounded playful, but the words planted themselves in people's minds. I watched Kevin from across the street start to ask Dylan about work instead of me, even when the question was about something that happened 20 years ago. I told myself it did not matter who got small talk at a grill, as long as the bills got paid and the trucks stayed full. A couple of years back, when Dylan and Kara had their second child, they started complaining about their cramped rental. They were drowning in toys and baby gear. I could see they were tired. That was when the idea came up for them to move into my place. It was too big for one man, and my attorney, Harriet, had suggested some tax advantages if the company bought the house from me and used it as part of a compensation package. The idea was simple in her view. the company would own the house, treat Dylan's residence there as part of his employee benefits, and I would stay on as both occupant and founder. The numbers made sense. The paperwork was neat. I liked the thought of hearing children in the halls again. We signed the documents in her office. The deed changed hands, but in my heart, the house still felt like the place my wife and I had painted together. Dylan and Kara did not see the legal layers. They saw boxes moving in and a sense of arrival. Over time, they stopped saying they lived with me and started saying I lived with them. When they gave directions to deliveries, they told people it was their place. When neighbors admired the new landscaping Kara picked, she joked that she had finally convinced the old landlord to let her make changes. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because it seemed easier than insisting on title details at a picnic. As Dylan took on more responsibility at the company, there were good days. He landed a lighting contract with a gym chain I would never have approached. He built relationships with younger project managers, spoke their language. I was proud and told him so. I started letting him run weekly meetings and handle more of the scheduling. But each step I took back, he seemed to take as proof that I was fading, not as an act of trust. He began talking about phasing me out in a joking tone. He told Kara and her friends that he was basically running everything, that I just signed checks. I heard it once from the hallway when I passed by their late-night kitchen talk. I stopped and stood there for a second, my hand on the railing, listening to my own son shrink me down to a signature. On the street, neighbors noticed the new trucks with Dylan's name on them and the social media posts. They started asking him about his business. When they asked me how retirement was, I would smile and say I was still working, still going in every day. They would look faintly surprised, as if they had forgotten I was part of the picture. That is how a man turns into a background object in his own life. It does not happen with one big fight. It happens with 100 small choices to let things slide so you do not start arguments at family dinners. I thought about all of this while I sat alone at the motel's small table, my back to the wall, the email from Samir still open. In the quiet, I could hear the ice machine humming outside and the low sound of a TV from another room. I pulled out my old wallet and found a card with Harriet's number printed on it. She had given me a stack of them years ago, saying to call her if I ever wanted to revisit our agreements. I had pushed them into a drawer and forgotten them. Now, one sat between my fingers. I did not call her that night. Instead, I opened my truck's logbook, the same paper notebook I had used for decades, and I made a list. I wrote down every major client we had. I wrote how many years we had worked with them. I wrote which contracts had my name on them, which ones had both, and which ones Dylan had secured alone. I wrote how many employees had been there 10 years or more. Seeing it in ink reminded me of something simple. The world that treated me as invisible had not built itself. The next morning, I checked out of the motel and drove to a small local diner I had been going to since before Dylan was born. The waitress, Maria, knew my usual order. She asked where I had been, saying she had not seen me in a while. I told her work had been busy. She asked how the kids were. I opened my mouth to say good and found I could not lie that easily. I said there had been some tension at home and that I was staying somewhere else for a bit. She put a hand on the back of my chair and told me families fought, that it would blow over. I nodded, but my gut said this was bigger than that. While I waited for my eggs and coffee, I sent a short text to Miguel asking if he was free for breakfast. He replied almost right away, saying he could be there in 20 minutes. When he arrived, he sat down heavily across from me, dust on his boots, hair still damp from a quick shower. He looked uncomfortable. He said the guys had heard about what happened in the driveway. Apparently, Kevin's teenage son had filmed part of it from across the street, and the story had traveled faster than I liked. Miguel said the crew did not know what to think. Some worried the company would break up. Others assumed Dylan was in charge now. Miguel looked me in the eye and asked gently if that was true. I told him, in simple terms, that Dylan thought he was in charge, but that ownership and title were not the same thing. I told him I had not signed anything giving the company away. Miguel listened, frowning. He said that at the yard, Dylan had been talking like he was already the owner, telling the younger guys that big changes were coming, that he would streamline the crew, bring in fresh blood, maybe let some older workers go. Miguel did not say his own name, but I heard it in the pause. He said Dylan had called me stuck in the past and told the crew they should get used to a new way of doing things. Some of the younger ones liked the sound of that. The older ones kept their mouths shut. Miguel said he tried to stay neutral, but that he told them one thing. Until they saw my name taken off the trucks, they should remember who had signed their checks all these years. Hearing that stirred something in me. This was not just about my pride. It was about people who had stood on ladders in the cold for me, who had missed dinners to finish emergency calls. I told Miguel I was not done yet. I did not tell him everything I was considering. I just said there would be a meeting soon, and that I hoped, when the time came, He would listen with an open mind. After he left, I sat there a little longer with my coffee, feeling the weight of decades of choices sitting on my shoulders. Dylan had called me a failure in front of our neighbors. He had said I never aimed high enough. But sitting in that diner, looking at the list in my notebook, I could see a different truth. I had built something steady. The problem was not that I had failed. The problem was that I had allowed someone who did not respect that work to stand in the center of it and pretend it was already his. I paid the bill, stepped outside into the bright morning, and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over Harriet's name in the contacts list. For years I had avoided this call because it felt like planning for an ending. Now, for the first time, it felt like planning to protect what still mattered. The sun was already high when I stood outside the diner with my phone in my hand and Harriet's name staring up at me from the screen. For years, that number had been a reminder of things I did not want to think about yet. Wills, succession plans, the idea that one day my hands would not be the ones turning on the workshop lights. Calling her had always felt like admitting I was near the end, standing there in my work boots with motel sleep still in my eyes and my son's voice echoing in my head. The call suddenly meant something else. It meant I was done pretending everyone around me understood what I had actually built. I pressed the button and held the phone to my ear. Harriet answered quickly, and her voice was calm, like it always had been, the same tone she used when she had walked me through zoning issues and insurance claims years before. I told her, in a flat and simple way, that I was not calling about another permit. I told her I had just been kicked out of the house my son lived in, that he had shouted in front of the neighbors that I was a failure and told me to leave with a suitcase. I said he had been pushing to make me sign papers that would give him control of the house and parts of the company's finances. I also told her I had not signed anything. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked the kind of questions lawyers ask when feelings are running hot. She asked whether there had been any new documents signed in the last year that I might have forgotten, whether I had ever put my name on any promise to transfer ownership to Dylan, whether there were any side agreements. I told her no. Everything formal that mattered had gone through her office. She stayed quiet for a moment, and I imagined her mentally sorting through the files she kept on me. Then she said we should meet as soon as possible. She suggested I come to her office that afternoon. I agreed. When we hung up, I did not feel comfort exactly, but I felt something solid under my feet again. After all the shouting and the motel silence, it helped to hear someone speak in clear, cool sentences about facts instead of feelings. Before the meeting, I decided to stop by the company. I did not tell Dylan I was coming. I parked my truck on the side street where I used to park before we could afford a bigger lot. From there, I could see the yard and the workshop entrance without being immediately spotted. The white trucks sat in their usual rows, ladders strapped tight, logos clean. A couple of crew members came out of the workshop, laughing, carrying coils of cable. They looked the same as yesterday, as if nothing in my private life had shifted. That is one thing about work. It does not stop moving just because your heart does. I walked through the side gate and into the main office area. The front desk clerk looked surprised to see me and then nervous, as if I was someone who had already been fired and had shown up unannounced. She greeted me in a cautious tone and said Dylan was in a meeting. I told her I was just there to pick up a few personal items. As I walked down the short hallway toward what had been my office, the difference hit me. The nameplate that used to carry my name now carried Dylan's, printed in shiny new letters, as if this had always been his place. The door was half open. I glanced in. The shelves that had held my old manuals and framed photos were arranged differently now. Dylan's framed certificates and a canvas print of one of his social media photos hung on the wall. A ring light stood in one corner. My old leather chair was pushed aside, replaced with something sleek and modern. A laptop and tablet sat open on the desk, both displaying dashboards that meant more to Dylan than to me. I felt like I was looking at a stranger's room that had grown out of mine like a weed. I stepped away quietly and turned toward the smaller office down the hall, the one I had offered to staff for years. Someone had stuck a handwritten label on the door with my name. Inside, my old filing cabinet sat in the corner, a little dented, but still locked. A cardboard box with my name scrawled on the side held some of my framed photos, my coffee mug, the little wooden lightning bolt my granddaughter had painted for me in kindergarten. I ran a hand over the box flaps and felt a tightness in my throat. On the wall behind the desk, the white paint was a shade richer where my old plaque used to hang. They had taken it down and left the cleaner rectangle of color like a ghost outline. I sat in the cheap office chair, opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, and pulled out a flat plastic box. Inside, in clear sleeves, sat copies of the founding documents Harriet had prepared years ago. The articles of incorporation, the share certificates, the original contract with our first big client. I did not spread them out or read them all. I knew enough from those days to remember the essentials. The shares in that folder were still in my name. The only way they would not be was if I had signed them away, and I knew I had not. I closed the box and slid it back into the drawer, leaving it slightly ajar like a reminder to myself. I took only the small wooden lightning bolt and put it in my pocket. On my way out through the yard, I saw Dylan at a distance, talking to a group of younger workers near one of the newer trucks. His gestures were large. He looked excited. I caught a few words carried on the air about change and new leadership. One of the crew glanced up, saw me, and nudged another with his elbow. Dylan turned, saw me for a second, and his expression tightened, but he did not walk over. He just lifted his chin in a short nod and then turned back to his group. In that small choice, I could see exactly where he believed we each stood. I left without speaking to him. At Harriet's office later, she greeted me with that same calm kindness she had used when my wife and I first sat in these chairs to talk about wills. The room was lined with books and framed certificates, but the desk was clear except for a notepad, a pen, and a single file folder with my name on it. She asked me to start from the beginning, but not the emotional beginning. She wanted the legal one, so I told her when the company had been formed, what changes we had made over the years, when we had set up the company purchase of the house, what roles Dylan held officially. I told her about the transition documents he had tried to push across the kitchen island, drafted by a friend. I described the driveway scene in simple terms. She took notes, nodding occasionally. Then she opened the file and pulled out copies of the share registry and the board minutes from the last few years. She pointed, with her pen, to the line that listed the majority shareholder. My name sat there, alone, with a high percentage next to it. Below that, in smaller type, was Dylan's name with a much smaller number and a note that his share grant was subject to conditions that had not yet been completed. She reminded me that we had never signed the follow-up documents that would have vested more shares in his name. Those drafts were still in her files, untouched, because I had asked for time to see how he handled responsibility. She said gently that in the eyes of the law, Dylan was not the owner of Marsh Electrical. He was an employee with some conditional shares and a job title I had given him. He could call himself whatever he liked on social media, but it did not change the ledger. She also reminded me about the house. She flipped to the property documents and showed me, without going into the fine details, that the registered owner was the company, not Dylan or Kara as individuals. Legally, their residence there depended on decisions made by the director and the policies the board set. She sat back and looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something in simple words. She said that for years she had watched me act as if I had no power, even while I signed the checks and owned the assets. She said it was not uncommon for parents and family businesses to do this. They let guilt and love cloud their view of the actual structure. She said that what Dylan had done on that driveway was not only cruel, but also built on an assumption that I would never use the tools I had. After that, she asked me about Samir's emails. I told her about the offer to acquire the company, about how I had brushed it aside. Her eyes sharpened. She said that if I was even half serious about no longer allowing my son to treat the company like his personal stage, I needed to consider that offer. She did not push. She just laid out what it would mean. A sale would mean I no longer had to watch my son slowly dismantle what I had built, pretending it was improvement. It would mean my crew would move under a larger umbrella that had systems and checks beyond our family drama. It would mean I could step away with enough money to secure my own future and to set something aside for my grandchildren, outside of Dylan's reach. Of course, there would be pain. He would feel betrayed. He would accuse me of choosing strangers over blood. I already knew that. I told her the hardest part of listening to Dylan call me a failure was not the words themselves. I had heard worse on job sites. The hardest part was seeing the flash of satisfaction in his eyes. The sense that he believed humiliating me made him bigger. Harriet listened and said that some lessons could not be taught with speeches, only with consequences. She said that if Dylan insisted on treating me like a guest in my own story, I had the right to leave that story on my own terms. When I left her office, the sky was a flat gray and the air had turned cooler. I stood on the sidewalk and watched cars stream past, people going about their business, unaware that one man at a small law office had just been told he still held the steering wheel everyone else thought he had dropped. I drove back toward the company but did not go in. Instead, I parked nearby and watched from the cab of my truck. Through the open yard gate, I saw Dylan come out with his phone in his hand, laughing with someone on the line, gesturing toward the trucks like a king surveying his fleet. The crew moved around him, respectful but not blind. I noticed Miguel glance my way, spot the truck, and give a small nod before turning back to his work. My phone buzzed on the dashboard. A new email had arrived from Samir, following up on my earlier message where I had said we needed to talk. The preview lines were short but clear. He wrote that his group remained very interested, that they respected founding owners who made tough decisions, and that if I wished, they could move on an accelerated timeline. As I read those words, I realized the line between thinking about action and taking it had grown very thin. Outside, the noise of drills and engines filled the yard. Inside the truck, there was only the soft tap of my finger on the screen as I began to type a reply. I did not send a long email back to Samir. I knew better than to pour my whole life story into a business message. Instead, I typed a short reply saying that I was ready to talk seriously, and that the final window he had mentioned might have arrived. I asked if we could meet in person within the next day or two. I added that our conversation would need to stay quiet for now. A few minutes later, parked there by the yard, I saw his answer pop up. He thanked me for the quick reply and said he could clear time the very next morning. He gave me an address for his regional office and said he respected how hard it was for a founder to even consider this step. That last line stuck with me. It had respect in it, something I had not felt much of from my own blood in a while. I closed my phone, watched Dylan laugh with the crew one more time, then started the engine and drove away before he could decide whether to wave or glare. That night, back in the motel room, I could not sleep much. The bed springs squeaked each time I rolled over. I kept seeing the company yard, the trucks I had bought and maintained, the faces of the men who had worked beside me in heat and cold. I also saw Dylan standing in my old office, talking big, knowing nothing about the quiet lines of ink that made all his talk possible. At some point, I sat up, turned on the cheap lamp, and took out my notebook again. I made a new list. On one side, I wrote what would happen if I did nothing. Dylan would keep stripping respect from me. He would take bigger and bigger risks with the company's credit. He would throw around the house and the trucks like props in his own show. On the other side, I wrote what might happen if I sold. The crew would answer to a larger group, not our family drama. I would no longer be used as a silent wallet. Dylan would finally be forced to learn the difference between owning something and standing next to it. The ink bled a little on the thin paper, but the columns were clear enough. By dawn, my mind had moved from if to how. The next morning, I put on a clean shirt and drove across town to the address Samir had given me. His office was in a glass building with a polished lobby, the kind of place I had only visited before to do switchboard work in the basement. The receptionist greeted me by name, which told me Samir had prepared. She handed me a visitor badge and pointed me toward a conference room with one glass wall and blinds half drawn. Inside, Samir stood as I walked in. He was in his late 40s, neat beard, calm eyes, a simple tie. He shook my hand firmly, not too hard, like a man who had spent enough time on job sites to know what a real grip felt like. On the table between us sat a carafe of water, 2 glasses, and a slim folder with my company's name on it. He did not open the folder right away. Instead, he asked me how I was, and he did not sound like he meant it as a throwaway line. I told him I had known better days. I said plainly that there had been tension with my son, that the way leadership was being handled at Marsh Electrical had become a problem. I did not badmouth Dylan. I just stated facts. My son believed he owned things he did not own. He treated staff like they were his audience, not his team. And he had thrown me out of the house while shouting insults in front of neighbors. Samir listened with a frown that looked more like concern than judgment. Then he opened the folder. He did not slide contracts across the table or wave numbers under my nose. Instead, he reviewed in simple terms what his group had seen from the outside. A company with an excellent safety record, strong repeat clients, and a founder who still came to work every day. He said, in careful words, that his team had noticed it was always my name on the old contracts, my signature under the big jobs. He said they had also noticed the sudden shift in tone on our public pages, the flashy posts, the way ownership was being spoken about online. They had wondered what that meant. I felt a flush rise in my cheeks. There is something raw about hearing your private family mess described from the outside. I told him that those flashy posts were my son's doing, and that while I appreciated his energy, I no longer trusted his judgment with the core of the business. Samir nodded and said that, from his perspective, a company like Marsh Electrical could fit well under his group's umbrella, but only if the transition was handled by someone who understood what had built it in the first place. He said they did not buy logos or social media feeds. They bought systems, contracts, and people. That was me and my crew, not my son's image. We talked through what a sale would roughly look like. He emphasized again and again that he wanted to retain key staff, including Miguel and most of the long-term electricians. He said they valued stability. He did not push numbers on me that day. He reminded me of their earlier offer range, which was already generous, and said that if I chose to move forward, they could finalize details quickly, including a solid sum wired to me on closing. I asked what would happen to Dylan in that kind of transition. I did not hide that he worked as operations manager. Samir was careful. He said they would evaluate all management roles based on performance and fit. He said no one was guaranteed a leadership position just because of their last name. He also said they would not base decisions on personal grudges. If Dylan could prove he was useful within their structure, he might have a place. If not, he would not. It was that simple. I let that sink in. It sounded harsher than a father's heart wanted, but kinder than what might happen if I let Dylan run the business into the ground with no guardrails. When our meeting ended, Samir did not try to shake on anything. He simply said that if I chose to move ahead, I should have my attorney contact their legal team, and they would prepare the necessary steps. In the lobby, before I left, I sat for a moment on a leather bench and called Harriet. I told her about the conversation, about Samir's tone, about the way he had described the purchase as something that could protect my crew. She listened and then said she wanted to see everything in writing before I agreed, but that from what I described, it sounded like a serious, respectful offer, not a vulture waiting for a fire sale. She suggested we meet again that afternoon. Before that second meeting, I stopped at my bank. The same branch manager who had signed off on our first line of credit years ago greeted me with a smile. He asked how business was. I said it was steady, but that I was thinking about some changes. I did not reveal details. I simply asked him, in plain words, to confirm the current state of our accounts and any credit tied to my personal guarantees. He pulled up the screen, turned it slightly so I could see balances without showing every line. He reminded me that the company's solid standing, even during tough years, was the reason the bank trusted our requests. Then he said a line that stuck. Honestly, Leo, when I see Marsh Electrical, I see you. You've always been the one I look at when we say yes. It was a simple comment, but it underscored everything Harriet had been telling me. The world of contracts and banks did not care about who shouted in the driveway. It cared about who signed the dotted line for 30 years. At Harriet's office that afternoon, we sat on the same side of the table, looking at a folder she had prepared. She had already contacted Samir's legal team to get a draft outline of terms. She did not lay it all out in front of me. She summarized. She said their offer amount matched what they had hinted at months before, adjusted slightly upward because the company had continued to perform well. She said they were willing to commit in writing to retaining specific percentages of staff and honoring current wages and benefits for a fixed period. She said they accepted that the founder, that was me, would have an advisory role for a while, then be free to step away fully. She also brought up something else. She reminded me of the documents we had signed when the company bought the house. She said that if the sale went through, the house would become part of the assets transferred, unless we carved out a different arrangement. She asked me what I wanted to do about that. I thought about Dylan's face when he shouted that I was a failure. I thought about Tara, my granddaughter, peeking around the corner. I told Harriet, quietly, that I did not want my granddaughter thrown into chaos. I said I did not care if Dylan had to move, but I did not want her on the street because of her father's ego. Harriet nodded. She said there were ways to structure things so that any decisions about the house would include some notice period, enough time for them to find somewhere else. She also said something I needed to hear. She said that protecting my granddaughter did not mean shielding Dylan from the consequences of his own choices. The two were not the same. We talked for a long time, trading simple, clear sentences. By the end, she asked me one more time if this was what I wanted. Not as a lawyer, but as someone who had known me through loss and rebuilding. I sat there and thought about the motel room, the suitcase, the diner, the list in my notebook. I thought about Dylan standing in my old office with my name scraped off the door. Then I told her yes. I wanted to move forward with the sale. I wanted to do it properly, with all the usual checks and formalities, and I wanted to make sure the crew heard the news from me, not from rumors. The next day, Harriet began sending messages back and forth with Samir's team. I stayed out of the details, trusting her to guard my interests. My job now was to prepare for the human side. That meant going back to the yard. I did not walk in shouting. I asked Miguel to meet me for a coffee on his break. We sat on the tailgate of one of the trucks, mugs in hand, watching younger guys load material. I told him that some big changes were coming, that I could not say everything yet, but that my goal was to protect the crew and the work. I said there would be a meeting soon, and I asked him to listen, not to gossip when that happened. He looked at me for a long moment, then said that after everything he had seen me do over 20 years, he would give me that much trust. As he spoke, Dylan strode across the yard, clapping one of the apprentices on the back, talking loudly about big plans and investor meetings. He barely glanced our way. Later that afternoon, as I sat in my truck outside Harriet's office waiting for a quick follow-up, my phone buzzed with a notification from our company group chat. Dylan had posted a message to all staff. It said there would be a mandatory all-hands meeting in the workshop on Friday afternoon for a major leadership and strategic update. A few seconds later, another message popped up from Harriet, forwarding me a note from Samir's assistant. It confirmed that their team would be on site Friday, ready to finalize and announce the transaction if I still agreed. I stared at the two messages, one on top of the other, and felt something in me settle. The stage my son thought he was building for his victory was going to be the same place he learned. in front of everyone, what ownership really meant. In the days between Dylan's group chat announcement and Friday afternoon, time felt both slow and sharp. Like every small moment had a new edge. I moved out of the motel and into a small room above an old friend's garage on the other side of town. It was nothing special, just a bed, a chair, and a window that looked out over a row of roofs, but it was quiet, and the air did not carry my son's voice. Every morning, I still woke up early out of habit. I made coffee on a little hot plate and sat with my notebook, adding to the lists I had already made. On one page, I wrote the names of my longest-serving employees. Miguel, the brothers who had wired half the schools in the city, the young apprentice who had stayed late every night for a month to finish a big project. On another page, I wrote the names of my grandchildren, even the baby who was too young to understand any of this. Seeing those names on paper reminded me that my decisions were about more than just me and Dylan shouting in a driveway. Midweek, I met with Harriet again. Her office had become the place where emotion turned into action. She had a few documents ready, but she did not slide them in front of me right away. First, she summarized where things stood. She said Samir's group had confirmed, in writing, the broad terms we had discussed. An agreed price, protections for the staff, an advisory period for me. She said their legal team was ready to move quickly, so that when we walked into that Friday meeting, we would not be speaking in hypotheticals. I sat there, hands folded, listening. She looked at me and asked if I had any doubts. I told her the only doubts I had left were not about the sale itself, but about what it would do to whatever thin line still connected me to my son. She said quietly that the line had already been worn thin on his side when he chose to humiliate me in front of neighbors, and that this decision might be the first time I treated myself with the same respect I had given him all his life. After that, she turned the documents around so I could see where to sign. I will not pretend my hand did not shake a little as I picked up the pen. I had signed many things in that office. Employee contracts, equipment loans, small acquisitions of other tiny firms. This felt different. I did not read every clause in that moment. Harriet had already walked me through them in plain words. I knew what I was agreeing to. The sound of pen on paper was soft but final. A notary came in, checked my identification, and watched me sign again where needed, then stamped the pages. There was no grand speech, just the quiet movements of people who do this kind of work every day. When it was over, Harriet said that from a legal point of view, the core agreement was in place. There were still steps to complete, but we had crossed the point where backing out would be simple. She asked if I was all right. I told her I felt like someone who had been carrying a heavy box for years and had finally put it down, only to realize his arms were shaking. On Thursday evening, I drove past my old street. I told myself I was just taking the long way around, but my hands turned the wheel without asking my permission. The houses looked the same as always, sprinklers ticking, porch lights clicking on as the sun went down. When I reached my old driveway, I did not slow down much, but I saw enough. Dylan's truck was parked at an angle again, shiny and loud. There were extra cars in front, belonging to friends or maybe people he wanted to impress. Through the open curtains, I caught a glimpse of Kara setting the table, fussing with napkins. It looked like they were having some sort of pre-celebration, probably telling everyone about the big leadership update coming on Friday. My stomach tightened, but I kept driving. A few blocks later, I pulled over at Ruth's house. She was sitting on her front porch, as she often did in the evenings, a blanket over her knees, a book in her hand. When she saw me, she put the book down and motioned for me to come up. I sat on the step below her and told her, in simple pieces, that I was not moving back in, that I was staying elsewhere for now, and that there would be some changes at the company. I did not tell her about the sale in detail, but I said that my time as the man behind those trucks was nearing a different kind of end. She listened quietly, then said she had wanted to call me after that day in the driveway, but she was not sure if it was her place. She said she had heard every word Dylan shouted, and that she had felt ashamed on his behalf. She said a son who could talk to his father like that had already forgotten who kept the lights on, both in the house and in life. Her words made my chest ache, not because they were harsh, but because they came from someone who had no reason to lie to me. Before I left, she told me that whatever happened, the people on this street who had known me for years still saw me as the man who had helped fix their breakers and jump their cars in winter, not as the failure Dylan had painted in a burst of anger. On Friday morning, I woke up before dawn, even earlier than usual. I sat by the small window of my rented room and watched the sky lighten. In a few hours, we would gather everyone in the workshop. Dylan thought he was going to stand in front of them as the new king of the yard. I knew we were about to show him, and them, a different truth. I felt no joy in the idea of seeing his face fall, but I also felt no urge to protect him from it anymore. There is a point where shielding someone from consequences turns into helping them hurt others. I had crossed that line for too long. I put on a clean work shirt, the same kind I had worn for decades, and took extra time to polish my boots. It felt right to walk into this moment as myself, not in a borrowed suit. On the way to the yard, I stopped by the bank. I was not there to gloat or to count money. I was there to make sure that when the dust settled, there would be a clear, calm path for me to stand on. The branch manager greeted me, and I quietly confirmed that the arrangements Harriet and Samir's group had set in motion were moving along. He nodded and said everything was proceeding as expected. He did not ask for details. The numbers on his screen told him enough. Before I left, he shook my hand and said that whatever changes were coming, I should be proud of what I had built. It was a small sentence, but it sat in my chest like a steady weight, something to lean on. When I reached the company yard, the place was buzzing. Trucks were parked in a loose semicircle to clear space in the center. Some of the crew leaned against tool racks, sipping coffee from paper cups. Others stood in small clusters, talking in low voices. A few had their phones out already, as if they expected something worth recording. It is the modern way. If a big moment happens and no one films it, did it really happen? I parked my old truck in a corner spot near the fence and stepped out. A few heads turned. Some of the older workers gave me small nods. One younger guy shifted his weight, clearly unsure which way the wind would blow. Inside the main workshop, someone had cleared an area between the workbenches and the rolling doors. A folding table sat at the back with a large coffee urn and a tray of store-bought cookies. Probably Kara's idea. Dylan stood near the center of the cleared space, dressed in a crisp shirt with the company logo embroidered on the chest. He had trimmed his beard and styled his hair. Kara was beside him, straightening his collar, whispering something in his ear that made him grin. When he saw me, his smile tightened. He walked over and said, in a controlled tone, that he was glad I had come, that it would mean a lot to the crew to see me supporting this next stage. I told him I was here because the crew deserved to hear the truth from the founder. His jaw flexed, but he did not argue. He assumed our truths were the same. Behind him, near the back door, I saw Harriet standing with a slim briefcase, her expression calm. Next to her stood Samir and two members of his team, dressed in simple business clothes, trying not to draw attention. They greeted me with small nods. No one made a show of their presence. To most of the crew, they likely looked like visiting vendors or clients. Dylan either had not noticed them yet or had assumed they were there to see him step up. The crew slowly filled the space, leaning on ladders, sitting on overturned buckets, some standing with their backs against the trucks. The hum of quiet chatter echoed off the metal walls. Someone near the front tested their phone camera, framing the scene. Another worker joked that the boss was finally going to make it official and that they wanted proof. I heard a younger electrician tell a new hire that this was the day the old man passed the torch, that things were about to get interesting. I let the words wash over me without flinching. I stood near the edge of the cleared space, between the crew and the visitors, feeling the cool concrete under my boots. The big wall clock above the tool cage ticked past the hour Dylan had set in his message. He clapped his hands together, called for attention, and the noise in the room faded to a low murmur. Phones lifted a little higher. One of the apprentices whispered that he was already recording, just in case this turned into something wild. Dylan stepped toward the makeshift center of the circle, shoulders back, ready to talk, as if he was already the man in charge. As he drew breath to begin his speech, I felt my phone buzz once in my pocket with a short message from Harriet. A simple line that said everything was ready on their side. I slid the phone back, looked around at the faces of my crew, at the visitors, at my son with his chest puffed out, and then took a slow step forward, into the space where everyone's cameras were now pointed. I stepped into the open space before Dylan could start, raised my hand, and asked everyone to give me a moment as the founder. The room went quiet in that uneven way where some people hushed others, and the phones all adjusted to frame us both. I said I had heard people talking about this being the day the torch passed, and that was true, but probably not in the way most expected. I told them calmly that for 35 years my name had been on the contracts, and that legally I was still the majority owner and managing director of Marsh Electrical. I nodded toward Harriet, who stepped forward with a slim folder and said, in clear words, that the share register showed my name holding control and that no documents transferring ownership to anyone else had ever been signed. Dylan laughed too loudly and said she was mistaken, that everyone knew he was the owner now, that this was just paperwork catching up. Harriet did not argue. She simply opened another document and said that as of that morning, the company had been sold to Pot Facilities Group for $8 million, with staff protections in place. Samir stepped up, introduced himself, and confirmed it, explaining that their group now owned the company assets, including trucks, contracts, and the house listed as a corporate property. The crew shifted, murmurs rising, some turning their cameras fully on Dylan as the color drained from his face. He demanded I undo it, said I could not sell his company, begged for a second chance. I told him quietly that you cannot lose what you never owned, and that consequences had finally caught up with the story he had told himself. Hours later, back in my rented room, my phone lit up with his name and the word calling, but I let it buzz on the table beside a single sheet from Harriet confirming closing, then reached out and turned the phone face down as the ringing stopped.